Welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast for women on leadership and life skills with Rhea Story.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast, the first podcast episode of 2025. This podcast episode is one of my favorites to do. Every year, I do a sort of a review of some of the books that I read in the previous year and sharing just some of the insights or takeaways or nuggets from a few that were most impactful. So when I titled this podcast episode, Best Books of 2024, best is very subjective because, again, I'm really focusing on books that were impactful or that I got an insight from or an aha moment or shifted a perspective, perhaps. And that obviously is very subjective, different to every individual and different to every individual's journey. But I love to share, again, some of the insights and takeaways that I've gotten for some of the books. If you've been following me for any length of time, you know I set a goal of reading 50 nonfiction books every year. So that averages out to about one a week. And that's really a goal that's, for me, set in the context of growth. That's one of the key components of my personal and professional growth plan is just making sure I'm intentional about averaging a nonfiction book a week. Now, there are some weeks I don't read any nonfiction books at all, just if we're traveling or speaking or, just gone or life is busy. And so typically what I find is when our speaking and travel schedule slows down for a few weeks, then I can absorb a lot more material and read a lot more books. And then when we're on the road speaking, obviously that decreases just from the lack of time and availability. But by just having a metric, an average goal of one book a week keeps me on track with making sure, hey, I am being intentional about reading those material nonfiction books that can help me grow. Now, this has shifted over the years because I much prefer to read a book rather than listen to it on audio. I just find I retain it better, I absorb it better, I understand it better. However, the nature of being in the car a significant amount, just traveling or going places or just going back and forth to different meetings or events, I find that the time in the car can be more valuable if I listen to an audiobook. So now I say I read or listen to 50 nonfiction books per year, and that's my goal. So a couple of them I might actually listen to on audio, but I think you get the concept of reading means internalizing the content. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into the nuts and bolts of today's episode. So not in any particular order, certainly not in any order of ranking of importance or anything, just in chronological order as I read them throughout the year. So the first book that I just wanted to touch on was a book called Metabolical. It's written by Dr. Robert Lustig. I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right. And this book was interesting because it really drilled down onto some of the things that I didn't realize about our food in general, and things that are not necessarily the healthiest things for us that are in our food. And if we're not very careful and very intentional about where we're getting our food from, are we getting organic food? Are we getting organic produce? Or what's in the hormones that the chickens that lay the eggs that you are getting at the grocery store might be? And some of it I did know. I didn't get a huge amount of just, wow, I didn't know that insights from this book, but it was definitely more of a very impactful reminder to be intentional about the sources for our food, right? Not just healthy eating. I mean, we all know the basic guidelines for healthy eating: eat more plants and less other things, drink more water and less other things, making sure you're exercising. But it really kind of brought home the importance of not just eating more vegetables, but making sure you knew where those vegetables came from, what may not have gone into those vegetables, including things like genetic modifications and things like that. And so it really just, again, kind of raised that level of awareness for me to be very intentional about that. And, you know, making sure that what I'm putting into my body is as healthy as I believe it to be, right? So very insightful, particularly if you haven't done any or a lot of research in what and how our food system and our economy came to be. It would definitely be an eye opener. So I get some insights, but just again, awareness and intention of being very specific about what are the things that we're putting into and onto our bodies. So metabolical. I read that one fairly early in the year last year, and it was interesting because it probably was January when I read that book, and I don't remember how I came across it. A lot of times when I hear somebody recommend a book or somebody says, "Hey, you should read this book," I have a list and I call it my growth reading list. And so just because somebody recommends a book doesn't mean it goes on that list. But if somebody recommends it, I will look at it, make sure that it's something that I'm interested in or that I can learn from and that I can grow from. And then I put it on my growth reading list is what I call it. And then when I find myself ready for another book, I can always go to that book. So it just gives me a great system of collecting those titles that say, okay, here is something that would be worth looking into. Maybe I'm reading 3 other books at the moment, but when I get ready, I always have a list of materials that are like, oh yeah, I already know I want to get this book. And let me just say, I touched on, I like to read a physical book, particularly nonfiction. I love to be able to highlight and quote and jot down, but I do read a significant number of books on my Kindle. Number one, if you are a person who travels any amount of time, you know that when you take an e-reader with you, you can take as many books as you want to. I used to be that person that if I went on a trip, I would always have like 3 books in my backpack. It was awkward. It was, difficult to do. It's kind of clunky. It's bulky. It's heavy. But having an e-reader allows me just so much more flexibility. The other thing that I find is that a lot of times I can get titles electronically, even free, like through the library. I can get the Kindle rewards points from Amazon, and then that allows me to get a lot of my reading material at little to no cost, which is great because if you're reading 50 nonfiction books a year, plus the fiction books I read, that means that if I were spending a significant amount of change on every single book, that could add up in a hurry, which would be fine. I'm just saying that having that resource as an e-reader allows me to get a lot of the books I read at little to no cost because I can get the electronic version. Again, you can download those often free from your library. So don't neglect that as a resource if you do a lot of reading. Fantastic resource there. Okay, so the second book that I found, one of the best books that I read in 2024 is called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. And I had read one of their books many years ago. So this book really just it was interesting for a number of reasons. The first and foremost, they talked about in the book that we as people look back in our memory, our recollections. The memories that stand out are the moments, right? You remember the moment you got married or the moment you graduated school or the moment you had a baby, right? Those moments are what stand out. And so when we look back over the course of our life, the majority of those powerful, impactful moments that stand out, those milestone moments, if you will, happen before we're 35. These could be career moments, again, graduations, weddings, maybe the birth of a child, meeting that significant other, whatever it is, those moments that are really just milestone moments that stand out. Most of them happen before we're 35. And so what we see, or what they talk about in the book, is that as we get older, you look back over the first 35 years of life, and so many of those moments stand out to you. Life is exciting, life is changing, many things to celebrate. And then the next 20 years, for example, you just don't have very many of those moments, those special moments, those moments of celebration, or those moments of just course change. Now, sometimes you do. And if you're intentional with growth, I think you have a few more of those. But as a general rule, the majority of those big moments in our lives happen earlier in life. Now, all that to say that makes it feel like life just speeds up as we get older because there's nothing that we can look back on the last year, or, for example, and go, wow, that was a powerful moment, right? It just sort of all blurs together because the days tend to become much more the same as we get older, more set in our ways, more set in our routines. And that's not necessarily good or bad, but just an interesting insight to think about. Now, what I loved, one of the other things that I loved in this book was they're talking about our ability as leaders, as people, to make moments impactful on purpose. And one example of that was somebody's first day on the job. And I don't remember the company, but you've probably started one or more new places to work over the course of your career. And what typically happens? You show up for that first day, you're not sure where to park really. You kind of, if you started to work, like when I went to work at a large hospital, I mean, I did know where to park. They did tell us that in orientation, but then I had to wander in the front door, and it was easy to get lost trying to find my way to the office that I needed to go to on the third floor, right? It was difficult to get through. The building's huge, it's confusing. And then, a lot of times what happens is you sit down to your desk that first day and you're staring at an empty spot on the desk. Like IT hasn't been able to get your computer up and running yet. And so you may not have a keyboard, or you may not have a computer monitor, you may not have a computer at all. And your email access hasn't been set up. And, all of that takes a few days. And you just kind of spend that first day or two or week kind of just figuring out things. And there's a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of, not intentionally, but there's just a lot of times, a lot of feeling like, hey, they're so busy that they're too busy to make sure I'm taken care of in that first day of work or first week of work. And then I think it was a John Deere company, but it was in another country. And I can't remember the country, but they had an example of taking that first day experience, what it was like for somebody to start work for the first day in their company. And they piloted a program where they had like the president of the company record a specific message for that individual welcoming them, so that when they sat down to work at their first day of work, not only was their computer up and running, they had a keyboard, they had email, but they sat down and the very first thing is a message, personalized message from the president of the division or department, welcoming them by name to start working for them. And then it all goes into, welcome to the most impactful work you will ever do. And it talks about why working here at John Deere is so impactful, how what you're doing plays a role in our food system. And, it just really did a great job of a powerful moment of somebody's first day. And it felt important. That person felt important. They felt like they mattered. They felt like the work they were doing mattered. And it really used that very possibly just a bland moment that everyone forgets, or worse, a bland moment that isn't so bland. It's one you wish you didn't have it to experience at all. And it turned it into a really impactful, powerful moment. And I love that because it's just talking about the power of moments and how we as people, as leaders, can be intentional about making sure those moments are impactful and meaningful in a positive way, right? When someone makes a big life decision, for example, how are we recognizing that? How are we celebrating that? It can be as little as when you decide to put away habits that no longer serve you. Is there a specific thing or process, or, not a ceremony, but is there a little something that you would want to do to say, hey, I'm putting that old part of me away in this box and I'm throwing that away because it doesn't serve me anymore. I'm opening the door to a new habit, to something that does serve me better. I could see a lot of applications for this. Again, really powerful book, not just as a person. It was interesting as a person, but in context of a parent or a leader or a teacher, it really brought some insight into why and how we should make sure that we're not ignoring the power of those moments. The third book that I wanted to talk on, this one was definitely outside the realm of a book that I normally would pick up for myself. And the book was called The Hidden Messages in Water by, and I'm sure I'm not going to pronounce this name right, but Masaru Emoto. And let me give you a little of the backstory. I heard Myron Golden, he was doing a video or a lesson on YouTube, and he was talking about, just sort of as an aside note, he was saying, "Oh, I read this book, The Hidden Messages in Water, and it was eye opening." And he goes on to explain, back in, I think it was the early 1990s, Dr. Emoto took a petri dish and wrote positive words on the petri dish. And then he took another petri dish and wrote negative words on the petri dish. And then he put water in both of the petri dishes. And then he flash froze the water so that he could photograph the crystals that the water formed when it was frozen. And the petri dish with the positive words had like these beautiful, intricate crystal patterns. And the petri dish with the negative words had just kind of disruptive, broken, incomplete crystal patterns. They just weren't the beautiful creations that were in the other petri dish. Now, that was interesting in and of itself, and Myron Golden was just touching on it again, an aside lesson that he was teaching. But then he went on to say, you know what? Why that's interesting is because your body is over 70% water. And if just energy in a petri dish can change how those water crystals were forming, what does that cause us to just think about or be intentional about the energy that we're putting into our body if our body's 70 something or more than 70% water? So I picked up a copy of the book. The book was basically a collection of photographs, and photographing water after like rock music was played versus Beethoven. And then every single time he would have this is what this kind of music would do, and this is what this kind of music would do, and he would photograph the water crystals. So it got a little bit, it lost me a little bit toward the end. I really enjoyed the pictures, and just again, kind of the interesting thing was, well, we don't really think about in context of energy, but like music, for example, what does that do to us physiologically? We don't really think about that, or I certainly had not thought about that. And so the book itself, it lost me a little bit in terms of the hypothesis behind why all this mattered or where some of this originated. It definitely got a little deeper than I thought. I thought it was just going to be kind of the study of what outside energy could do to water. But it was still interesting, and the photographs themselves were really fascinating. So it was an interesting book, but again, I kind of stumbled on that one as an aside. But definitely just kind of a reminder of how important the energy that surrounds us or that goes into us can impact us. We could take that as far as or as little as, what is our office clean? Is our home clean? I know I feel better when everything's clean around me. It's one of the things that if I come home from a trip and the house isn't clean, I just don't feel as good, right? I before we leave to go on a trip, the dishes get washed, the laundry gets done, everything gets picked up, because I really love that homecoming feeling of coming home to a clean, organized space. And so I know that about myself. But again, this book was interesting because it really just kind of reminded me to be intentional about those energy things around us that can affect us positively or negatively. And water in and of itself, I'm funny about. If water tastes funny, I really don't, like if I can taste too much of the chlorine or something like that, I don't want to drink it. So again, it was an interesting book. I kind of stumbled on by accident, but very interesting in terms of that reminder. All right, number 4 on this list that I wanted to touch. And again, I just picked out, the top 5 that really stood out to me. I could do a whole nother podcast episode on some of the other books, but these were the ones that were just most interesting or impactful. This book, number 4 on the list, was Outlive by Peter Attia, or Attia. I think it's Attia. And I didn't get a whole lot of really great insights out of this book. Much of it were things that I was aware of and conscious of already. And, it's talking about how important it is for sleep to our health. And Outlive, the whole concept of the book Outlive was really not just living long, having longevity in and of itself, but having life in those years, right? So not just years, but being able to have a great life, being able to be healthy enough to enjoy life in those later years. And, again, not a super lot of insights. It talked about why sleep was important and how sleep was important and getting enough sleep was important in the prevention of Alzheimer's, and again, these are things we knew. It basically was like eat healthy, exercise, sleep, those things. But one thing that really stood out for me in this book was he talked about decide now what you want the last 10 years of your life to look like. For example, if the average life expectancy might be 75, maybe a little less for men, maybe a little more for women, but let's just use that number. So let's just say average life expectancy is 75. What do you want your life to look like from, let's say, 65 to 75? Do you want to be able to be healthy enough to hike up a mountain? Do you want to be healthy enough to just climb the stairs in your house? Do you want to be able to go for a walk with your grandkids? Do you want to be able to ride a bike with your grandkids? Do you want to be able to do yoga or exercise? Whatever it is, you have to decide what you want out of that last decade of your life to look like in terms of mobility and enjoyment of life and doing the things that you can do, that you're healthy enough to do. And once you know that, then you need to back down and go, well, what do I need to be able to do or working on today in order to make sure that that can happen? For example, if you wanted to hike up a mountain at age 70, you need to have a certain VO2 max, which is basically the amount of oxygen your body can process today. And then that was interesting to me because I'd always, maybe not always, but most of the last 2 decades, certainly, I've been intentional about exercising, cardio and strength and mobility, working on those 5 dimensions of fitness, but I'd never had a direct connect to, if I want to be able to go for a jog when I'm 60, I need to be able to run, a 9-minute mile today. And I'm just giving an example. I'm not saying that those are the numbers or those are the numbers for everybody, but it gave me a direct connect to be able, if I want to do this when I'm that old, I need to make sure that I'm intentional about working on this today. Some of the powerful things, grip strength, he talked about in the book, hand grip strength. Why that's important, because most of us, as we get older, balance can be an issue. And a lot of times when you start to trip or you think you're going to fall, you can reach out and grab something. But if you're not physically strong enough to catch yourself, then you'll fall and you could break a hip. And then a lot of times if you break a hip, that's a beginning of a downward spiral health-wise. And so again, that was interesting to me because I'd never thought about, I need to be intentional about my grip strength now so that if I ever trip going up the steps in 20 or 30 or 40 years, I'm strong enough to catch myself and prevent that fall. So that in and of itself was thought-provoking. Just again, kind of raising that level of awareness of intention and what does that look like in day-to-day changes today. Last but not least on my list, this was a book I've read before, and I maybe shouldn't have quite included it on this list because I didn't quite get finished with it the second time around. The book is Like a Rock, Becoming a Person of Character by Andy Stanley. And I have read this book many years ago. In fact, I talk about it's probably the number one book for me in terms of character growth and development early in my journey. And I don't know what made me pick it up again, but I did probably about 3/4 of the year, maybe about September. I think I was looking for a specific quote or something like that. And so I picked it up again. I'm like, wow, I got a lot of highlighting, a lot of notes out of this book the first time around. I'm going to start reading it again. So I went to start reading it again. And as I was talking about it with Mac, he was like, maybe I should read that book. He's like, you've talked about it quite a lot in the past. I think I'll start reading it. And so I put that book aside because I was reading so many other books and I said, sure, you take it. And so then I picked it back up and, put it back and picked it up and put it back down, picked it up and put it back down because I'm always reading about 6 or 8 books at one time at any given moment. And so I didn't quite get finished with that book the second time around, but it was even more powerful the second time around reading it. Um, Talking about like quality of our character determines the quality of our relationships. And, you know, he talks about that if you're the type of person that every relationship in your life is filled with conflict, that's a sign of your character. So things like that. And again, I got so much more out of it, even the second time around, reading through it, probably because I've grown quite a bit since I read it the first time. But it's always interesting, right? When you read something that um, provokes you to thought, when you grow, you have different thoughts. And so you might read the same book 5 years later and get more out of it. I certainly have a number of books have been like that for me. The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People being one of them, Five Levels of Leadership by John Maxwell being another one. Those books that I can read more than once and get something um, from them every time I read it. And so that, that's always a really impactful book when you can go back through it again a few years later and go, I've grown and I can see how I've grown. I see things at a different level of awareness. So there you go. The top 5 books for my book list of 2024. I'd love to hear if you have some recommendations for me on books that have been impactful in your journey that you read last year. Send me an email, ria@riastory.com. Drop me a note, send me a PM. Always looking for great book recommendations to add. And who knows, they might be the books that I cover that are impactful for this year, 2025. Until next time.